Well, I've been researching the European Union for a long, long time. And coming from Britain, we've been aware of that going way back, because there was many years when there was an argument over whether Britain would go in, or when de Gaulle in France was saying no and all the rest of it. And then along came this man called Ted Heath, who became Prime Minister in, I think, 1970 to 74. And he has been pressing for British membership for a long time. He becomes Prime Minister and he signs us into what was the European Community, the common market. So from the early 70s, I think it was about 73 we went in, I've watched this unfold in Britain, and the effect has been devastating in so many ways in terms of control and dictatorship and laws and regulations. And so when I started investigating the conspiracy from the early 90s, one of the areas of focus, because of my background in Britain, was what is the European Union as it's become? What's behind it? Because the foundation of the global conspiracy that I've been exposing all these years is to centralize power, for a simple reason. If you have lots of diversity of decision-making, then any central few are not going to have power over all that diversity. There's too many points for them to control to get the decisions that they want. So what you need if you're a dictator, look at any dictatorship, look at communism, look at fascism, look at any of these forms of dictatorship, and what do they want? Centralization of power, dictating to everyone and everywhere, because only then can you have that central power where what you say and what you decide affects everybody. Now, once I'd started to realize that centralization of power, and of course on a global level, we now have a name for it, it's gone so far, globalization. Globalization is simply the agenda and the conspiracy that I've been exposing all these years. We now have a name for it. And so once you realize that centralizing power is key to it, then you've got to look at the European Union. Because what is that? There was a time when people were gathered together in tribes. And in that tribal situation, they made decisions that affected the tribe. Compared with the world today, few people were deciding their own fate in so many ways. Then you had the movement to gather those tribes together under a central rule, and we called those nations. What we call nations, they're just a gathering together of different tribes. So now, the central rule of the nation, what we call the government, is now deciding at that central point what happens to the lives of all those tribes that formerly were deciding their own destiny and making their own decisions. Now, because this conspiracy is a stepping stone movement towards a global dictatorship, then the constant movement to further centralization is essential to bring that about. So what we now started, or then started to see through the European Union, was the gathering together of nations under a central dictatorship, central rule. And of course, after the war, when tens of millions of people had been killed and maimed to stop a centralized dictatorship in Europe under the Nazis from becoming real, you had a situation where if those that wanted this European Union centralized state that we have now had come out after the last war or in the 1950s and said, okay, we want to reform the government of Europe. We want centralized control. We want a bureaucracy which we'll put in Brussels, which will dictate to the whole of Europe, we're going to have a situation where that bureaucracy, whatever it decides, overrides any laws decided by national parliaments. We're going to have a president of Europe who is going to become the central figure of authority. We're going to have a foreign minister for the whole of Europe. We're going to decide foreign policy for the whole of Europe. We're going to have a European army. On and on it would go. What would people have said after the last war in the 1950s? Hold on a second. We've just fought a war to stop that. Because Hitler wanted something similar, a United States of Europe. So they didn't tell us that, even though right from the start, as my research shows in great detail, that was the plan. So what do? They use what I call the totalitarian tiptoe. You're here, and you know you're going there, but you know if you go there too quickly, people will say, hold on, what's going on? Because the change is so great. So what you do first is you say, we're going to have a free trade zone. And it won't take anything away from you, won't touch your sovereignty, but it will be great for jobs. We're going to bring trade barriers down. It'd be really good. Okay, all right. And then you start. Well, you know, this free trade zone, yeah, it would be much more kind of efficient and work better if we had a few rules that everybody had to obey. Okay, you're moving. And over this period, from the 50s up to now, incessantly you've seen this stepping stone of more and more centralization of power in the European Union. And this Lisbon Treaty now, that the Irish have at least postponed by voting against it, that will massively increase the centralization of power. For a time, you had what they called the veto, where a country could veto the introduction of a European law if it didn't agree with it. That whole process of countries vetoing the laws is now being eroded rapidly, and what they want to get to is a place where there is no veto. If you're in the European Union, what the central bureaucracy, like the Politburo, that's all it is in the former Soviet Union, says is going to happen, and you're going to have no say or veto of stopping it affecting your country. So you see this, and how it fitted perfectly, the European Union, with this centralized global dictatorship that I've been exposing. So when I started looking behind it, the same organizations, the same families that are behind and have been behind so much, including the manipulation of the Second World War, turn out to be the people behind the European Union. And crucial to understanding the background is an organization called the Pan-Europa movement. Now, this goes back to the 1930s at least. And the Pan-Europa movement is an organization controlled by the Habsburg family, the Habsburg dynasty. And it still exists today, and Otto von Habsburg is still the head of it. And it was that organization in the background that manipulated the movement, first of all, to the free trade zone, and then, of course, through the decades, as I've described, to this centralized superstate that we have now. And here we are in Croatia, which ended, it thought, Habsburg rule, Habsburg dictatorship. And now the government of Croatia, and I understand the main opposition parties too, they should be absolutely ashamed of themselves, the way that they are pushing this forward without any public debate and clearly no questioning or looking at the background to what this is all about. They are proposing to sign back, in effect, control of this country to the Habsburg dynasty and their connected families and groups that are actually the force behind the European Union. And the same technique is being played all over the world. We now have an African Union which is being more and more moved to becoming a whole of Africa dictatorship. We now have the African Union Army. More and more rules and laws are coming in Africa that dictate to every African country. In America, we have a free trade zone called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and that is now very close to being turned into the North American Union, their version of the European Union, when the Canadian and American dollars and the Mexican peso will be replaced by another currency which has at least a working title of the Amero. And they want to do the same as they're doing in the European Union and in Africa and America in the Pacific, where they have a free trade zone called Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, and they want an Asia Eastern, Australian, etc. version of the European Union. So eventually what they want is to pick off every single country in the world into one of these unions, and these unions will answer to the world government. Crucially also, they've produced the maps. The European Union has done this. They want to break nation states up into regions, and they'll sell it as if it's diversity of power, when really what they're doing is breaking up any unity of response to this edifice of superstate and world government power by breaking up nation states that exist today into regions. And in the map they produce for Northern Europe, the European Union, it was in a British newspaper, they've taken regions of Britain, and in the way that they've constructed the regional structure, they've taken regions of England and other parts of Britain, and they've put them together not with other regions in Britain, but with regions in Scandinavia or a region in France. They want the end of the nation state. And Croatia has no idea what it is about to let itself in for, and its government and opposition parties are a disgrace that they are allowing this sleepwalk to happen to the, in terms of Croatian culture and sovereignty and ability to make its own decisions. That sleepwalk is heading very fast for the edge of a very, very deep cliff. Well, again, this fits into the whole structure that I've been exposing all these years, because many years ago now, I picked up this stream through history of the Babylonian trinity of a goddess, moon goddess, they symbolize her as, called Semiramis, their sun god, Nimrod, who's also known as Bel or Baal in the ancient world, and their virgin-born son in Babylon, this is thousands of years BC, long before Christianity, called Tammuz. And the Babylonian trinity was moved eventually and relocated from Babylon to Rome under the Roman Empire, and that became Almighty God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which we call Christianity. The Son became Jesus instead of Tammuz. And the Holy Spirit, or Holy Ghost, was symbolized, or is symbolized, as a dove, which is precisely what the goddess of Babylon in that Babylonian trinity was symbolized as. Also, all the attributes that the Babylonians gave to Semiramis, their goddess figure, of the Virgin Mother, the Queen of Heaven, and all the rest of it, they were all put onto Mother Mary when the Babylonian religion was relocated to Rome under another name. And this is why the holy days of the Roman Church and Christianity are the same holy days as they had in Babylon thousands of years earlier. They've just called them different names and used different kind of hero figures and put it in a different historical context. Now, these family bloodlines that are behind the European Union and are behind this centralization of global power, this gathering Orwellian state, actually come out of what is now Iraq, formerly Babylon, and before that it was Sumer, Babylon in Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. And as those bloodlines have moved out of that area and up into Northern Europe, where they became the aristocracy and royal families of Europe, and then they moved into the political realm and the banking realm and these institutions that dictate to the world today, they took with them their religion and their rituals. And right at the heart of that is this Babylonian trinity, and the goddess figure, Semiramis, is really crucial to that. Give you a very obvious example. As these bloodlines moved up into Northern Europe and the area we now call France, of course, they took all these things with them. And when the bloodlines expanded across to the Americas during the European empires of Britain and France, etc., obviously they took their bloodlines, their family network there, and they continue to control America, but they also took the rituals and the goddess and of everything. And when you look at the way that this Babylonian goddess, Queen Semiramis, was depicted in the ancient world on coins and things, it is an absolute mirror image of the Statue of Liberty. And why would that be? Because the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor was given to New York by French Freemasons, part of the secret society web that the bloodlines used to manipulate the world. It was given to New York by French Freemasons in Paris who knew what the Statue of Liberty really represented. And it wasn't liberty, it was the goddess of Babylon. And she's holding a flame, which is the symbol in Babylon of Nimrod, the sun god of Babylon. And in Paris, to this day, on an island in the River Seine, is a mirror image of the Statue of Liberty. It's extraordinary when you go there and you look at it. And you know, if your eyes were shut and someone said, okay, open your eyes, and you looked up, where are you? You'd say, I'm in New York. Look, it's Statue of Liberty. No, it's on the River Seine in Paris. And you see this recurring symbol of the goddess, particularly with the spikes around the head, all over the world. Like the goddess of the French Republic is Semiramis depiction. The goddess of the District of Columbia, where Washington is in America, is Semiramis. Again, the depiction. Now, when you start to look around the ancient world, it seems to be just an explosion of gods and goddesses under different names and stuff like this. The goddess of this and the goddess of that and the goddess of the other. Oh my goodness, so complicated. I can't follow this. Once you realize that as this Babylonian Trinity religion moved through Europe, all they did was take that and use different names for the same deities. So all across Europe and the wider world, you see all these deities and goddesses and gods under different names, but they're the same deities, the Babylonian deities, just called different names. And one of them is Europa, the goddess Europa. That's what Europe is named after. Now, we've talked before about the obsession that these bloodlines have with symbolism. Well, it just so happens that one of the key symbols for the Babylonian goddess under different names is 12 stars in a circle, which just happens to be, sits back in amazement, the symbol of the European Union. Who decided that was going to be the symbol of the European Union? Those that manipulated into place the European community, which became the Union. And of course, it's the symbol of their goddess, in this case, Europa. And so they use their symbol right at the heart of the logo of the European Union. And that is saying something. That is saying this is the realm or the union of the Babylonian goddess, which represents, symbolizes these bloodlines and their control. And when you look at the ancient stories about Europa, who again is Semiramis under a different name, they tell the story of how she, as a woman, rode on the back of this bull, which is a symbol of Nimrod, So it's Europa Semiramis riding on Nimrod. And 2005, the European Union brought out a commemorative coin which depicted Europa and the bull, Semiramis and Nimrod from Babylon, on it. And the people behind that knew exactly what they were symbolizing. And so we now have this situation where this organization, which was created by these bloodlines, really at the heart of it, the Habsburgs, which connect into the Rothschilds, etc., they've set basically a fishing net or a spider's web. You can symbolize it in many ways. And there it sits. And then countries come in and they get caught in the web. And once they get caught in the web, the legislative laws, rules, and regulations of that country immediately start to change dramatically and come under European law. And then everything is so connected to everything else in Europe that even if anybody already wanted to get out, they are so glued to the European Union structure by then, through finance and business and all the rest of it, they can't get out. So what I would say to the people of Croatia, you are making a forever decision here, certainly forever in the terms of lifespans that we're talking about, going into the European Union. Because once you're in, if you're saying, oh, we don't like this, let's get out, oh, forget that. Because you're going to be in the web so fast legislatively and in terms of dependency that there is no, oh, let's get out. So again, when you put all this together, this is happening in this country, certainly at a political level, with absolutely no debate. Okay, let's see the good things and let's see these other things. No, oh, we're just going in. Over the cliff. Well,
pretpostavljam da imate nešto iskustva.
It's strange to me. Well, not strange because I know how the system works, but it's amazing to me, if I didn't know how the system worked, that I look around Zagreb at parliament buildings and government buildings, and what I see is next to the Croatian flag, I see the European Union flag flying next to it. Croatia's not even in the European Union yet, and I understand this has been going on for quite a time. And what that is symbolic of is that this is a done deal. You know, there is an agenda to enslave through this union every country in Europe, and further out. They want to expand as far out as they can. And this is not we will try to persuade people that it's good to join the European Union. This agenda is you're going to join. And by the way, we're not going to persuade you to agree to more and more centralization of power in Europe. We are going to do it, okay? And we're seeing this now in Ireland. To keep this thing moving, they had to have get-out clauses in the early days so that people were a bit more comfortable about going in. For instance, I mentioned earlier the veto. If you go into a union of nations, and at least you know you have a veto, if the union decides something that is going to adversely affect your country, or it's something you don't want, you have this veto. You can say, no, I'm blocking that, and I have the power to do. Now, that was to get people in and moving. Now, they're, like I say, removing the veto. So eventually, the bureaucracy in Brussels will be a dictatorship with no way of overcoming that and denying its omnipotence. One of those checks and balances up to this point, and they're about to destroy this, was that major constitutional changes, etc., had to be agreed by every nation for them in the Union to become law. And the idea was that, well, we're going to control the people in the governments of the nations, so it's not a problem. We'll give them that, but it's not really a check and balance because we'll get the government to agree to do what we ask. But on one or two occasions, there was one in Holland, there was one in France, and more recently in Ireland, those countries had referendums giving the people the opportunity to vote on whether they wanted to give still more centralized power to the European Union. So they wanted to bring in this, what they now call the Lisbon Treaty. But it was originally called the European Constitution. So the Dutch and the French in their referendums voted against the Constitution and said, no, we don't want it. Now, because of this law, which they're now getting rid of, that meant the Constitution couldn't happen. So what did they do? They took 98%, this is from European Union people, 98% of what that Constitution said, and they called it not a constitution, they called it a treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. And those countries that had promised their people a referendum on the Constitution, like Britain, and the British government knows if it had a vote, a referendum on the Constitution, they'd lose. So what they then said is, oh no, we don't have to keep our promise anymore to give you a referendum on the Constitution because the Constitution's dead. It's just the treaty now. And we didn't promise we'd give you a referendum on the treaty, but the Constitution. So that's how they get round it. And they've got round that by saying, oh no, the Dutch and the French, they voted against the Constitution. We're now talking about this treaty, which is just 98% of the Constitution, right? So now we come to the Irish, and a very wealthy man funded a campaign in Ireland to let the Irish people see far more about the real background to the European Union than they would normally get. The Irish voted against having this treaty happen. So in a democracy, which of course the European Union isn't, it's a farce, you would say, well, that's, we did our best, but the Irish have vetoed. No, they're now pressing the Irish, and you watch it happen, they're pressing the Irish government to have another referendum in Ireland on the same question. And what they then do, they did this in Denmark, is they look at those areas where they can undermine the no campaign enough to cross the line. Now, when the line is crossed, in other words, they've now got the decision they want, no one's then going to say, well, let's have another referendum because, we've had two and one went this way. No, we've got the result we want now. They've said, yes, we can introduce this further centralization, no more referendums. And of course, as I've said before, the more you centralize power, the more power you have to centralize even quicker. So as they centralize more power in Europe, they then have the power to say from the center, we're bringing an end to all this veto stuff. We're bringing an end to all this, you'll have a referendum to say yes or no to great constitutional and centralization of power. All that's dead, okay? We're ruling now. And, I've said in my talks when I come to Croatia that people talk about troops massing on the border, waiting to invade a country. Well, there is something amassing on the border of Croatia now. And it's not troops and tanks, it's legislation. And it is a tidal wave that is going to hit this country of 5 million people in a European Union of 500 million people. And people in Croatia are going to be staggered by the way this country changes after the government, if the people allow it, sign Croatia into the European Union. Whenever you look at these institutions and structures of these families that are behind this conspiracy, it is just like a spider's web. They catch people in a mountain of laws, rules, and regulations. sub-clauses, fine detail. I mean, the vast, overwhelming majority, I'd say 99% of legislation that is passed by politicians is legislation they have never read. And so the people who write the legislation decide what's in it. And then what happens is the politicians are given certain headlines about and a summary of what's in it, because they never read it. And then they have the debate over these headlines. But in the depth and the detail of this legislation is fantastically detailed impositions of do's and don'ts and can'ts and mustn'ts and all the rest of it, which gets passed but is never talked about. And then people go, hold on a second, what do you mean I can't do this? That's in subclause 7B/457. Here, look. You never told me about this. Ooh, it was in the legislation you voted for. And from the time that Britain went into the what is now the European Union in 73, I have watched this European Union legislation just get added to and added to and added to and added to the point where it is now dictating the fine detail of the lives of people in Britain, and 75% and growing of the laws that are introduced in Britain today originate with the bureaucrats, unelected by the way, in Brussels, and not even with elected politicians. And now, we at least, who've been in the Union for a long time, have had the ability to go with this stepping stone and see it added to. This is what is amassing on the border of Croatia. All that mountain, tidal wave, however you want to symbolize it, of legislation that has been built up in the European Union since its creation as a common market, that's amassing on the border. And soon as your leaders go, we're in, they invade. That legislation invades this nation of 5 million people. You have no idea what that means, because people are going to be staggered by how their ability to live and the decisions they can make and the impositions on you can't do this, you can't do that, are going to impact on their lives when this starts. The end of Croatia as you know it. Because we in Britain are a country of nearly 70 million people. And we have been absorbed and dictated to by these bureaucrats. Croatia is a country of 5 million people. It's going to be swallowed whole by these people. And the government of Croatia is having no debate. It is an absolute national disgrace. And if people do not start to look at this, then they should not complain when the tidal wave hits them, as it will.
What's interesting as we sit here now is that what I've been writing and talking about for over 20 years now, but nearly 22, is coming to a point where it can be clearly seen. But it's like everything. If you are faced with a lot of information, but you don't, if you like, have a sat-nav or a roadmap, then it can be a series of dots, what's going on. But when you see a few, what I call coordinates, suddenly these bewildering dots become a tapestry, and you can see how they all fit together. And I guess the main ones are, first of all, where does this cabal of families and their secret society network that I've been exposing for 2 decades, where do they want to take the world? Well, it's a simple equation. When there's a few of you and you want to control literally billions more and more fiercely in a much more and more tyrannical way, then you have to centralize decision-making. the more points of decision-making there are, the more diversity, the less control any central cabal is going to have, because there's just too many points to have to keep manipulating. So what they set out to do a very, very long time ago is to constantly and incessantly centralize power. And this is going back. This has not been going for a few decades. We're going back to this process to when humans organized themselves in tribes. And in those days, the people of the tribe decided what happened in the tribe. Then we reached a major stepping stone in this process, where lots and lots of tribes were brought together under what we call nations. Now, a few people at the center of the nation, the country, are now dictating to all the other tribes. And what we've got in Europe, Croatia's not going to join. You're not going to join, are you? Oh, for goodness sake. We've got in Europe, in the European Union, and other unions that they want. They've got an African Union, they want an American Union, a Pacific Union, a Middle East Union, and so on. We have a situation now in Europe where the countries that absorb the tribes are being absorbed by this superstate. And thus now, at the center of the superstate are a handful of dark-suited bureaucrats, not even elected people, who are dictating to all the former countries who were dictating to all the former tribes. So what we see is this incessant centralization of power. We see it not only in politics, but we see it in corporation ownership, in banking ownership, in media ownership, and for a long, long time now, we've had a name for it, globalization. What people call globalization is merely this agenda I've been exposing all this time, unfolding around the world. So where's it going? Well, ultimately, what they have been working towards is a structure whereby they have a world government which dictates to every country. In fact, in the end, they want to break the countries up into regions. They have a world central bank which dictates all global finance. A world currency which wouldn't be cash, it would be a single electronic currency, the same one for everyone in the world. And of course, there are massive implications for freedom in, single electronic currencies or electronic currencies in general, because when you go into a store or whatever to buy something today, and you hand over your electronic money, a credit card, and the computer says no to you, then at least, although it's going out of circulation so fast, at least you can pay cash. When there is no cash, that computer's deciding above barter whether you purchase or not. That's the idea. Then they want a world army to impose the will of the world government on anyone who doesn't just take the diktats from the cabal at the center, the world government. And we've reached the point now where we have a de facto world government and a de facto world army which is operating in a de facto way in the way they want this structure to work, i.e., we have a world government under code terms like international community, G8 and all this stuff. And, of course, it's not the international community. It's the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Israel, and this little cabal. It's not a world community at all, but they just call it that. And then what happens, as we've seen in Libya, and as they want to do in Syria, and of course, too in Iran, they want a situation where the world government would then send the world army in to sort out any country that wasn't playing ball. What have we had this summer now? A situation where the world community, the international community, demonizes people like Gaddafi, demonizes people like Assad, and having done that, they send the boys in. NATO, de facto world army. So we've actually reached the point now in this process where what they want it officially with world government, world army names is actually playing out in a de facto way already. And so how do they take us there? They take us there by mainly two mass manipulation techniques, not just mental manipulation, but emotional manipulation. The first one I call a long time ago now, problem, reaction, solution, where you want to change the world in a certain way, and you know that if you openly offer that way forward, you're going to get a big reaction against it. People are going to say, what are you doing? What are you doing? So what you do is you don't announce it openly. You play problem, reaction, solution. Stage one, you create a problem. Could be a financial collapse. It could be a government collapse. It could be a terrorist attack, which you engineer and blame someone else for, like 9/11. And then you tell the public through an overwhelmingly unquestioning media the version of the problem you want them to believe, i.e., bin Laden orchestrated 9/11 from a cave in Afghanistan, I hope he had a good battery on his phone, But anyway, then at stage two, you want the reaction of outrage, of fear, of something must be done. And then you, who have created the problem covertly, then have got that response, that reaction, do something. You then openly offer the solutions to the problems you've created, which are changes in society and changes in legislation and changes in the structure of society and government, which advance your agenda of centralization of power. And we have such a wonderful example now in our area of the world. Because, you see, what I've just described, problem, reaction, solution, is why the world has been incessantly, right up to now, constantly bombarded by problems, upheavals, crises, things that don't work. It's a simple explanation why. When you have a situation that works, that is in harmony, that people are happy with, you try telling them you're going to change it. What are you doing? Everything's fine. If it's not broke, don't mend it. Go away. So you have to keep making sure the status quo in whatever area of society we're talking about consistently doesn't work. So what you do is you create a problem to make sure it doesn't work in a certain area. You then get the reaction, which allows you to offer your solution. But the solution's not designed to solve the problem. The solution is designed to further centralize power and change society in the way you want it, and to create the next crisis, which you can do the process through again. And what we're seeing now in Europe, coldly calculated, mercilessly abusing the people of Europe to advance this agenda, is the engineered economic catastrophe in Europe, which is designed, and my goodness me, as we sit here, they're saying it already. People like Jose Barroso, who I wouldn't trust to tell me the time in a room full of clocks, by the way, the president of the European Commission, Herman Van Rompuy, the president of Europe, the European Union, who's never seen a ballot box where anyone from the public put a vote in. People like Merkel in Germany and Sarkozy in France, they are now using a term they were terrified of using before because they didn't want to frighten the children. Because it's not real. No, over the years they've said, no, we're not trying to create a super state. No. Yes, you are. And now they've reached the point where they're saying to solve the economic problems of the European Union, which they have covertly engineered, they must have deep integration of Europe and European countries into this bureaucratic spider's web that we've been manipulated into all these years. And when you consider that now something like 75% of the laws that are introduced in Britain affecting the British people originate in the Commission in Brussels, that's now what on earth are they contemplating in terms of the centralized control of Europe when they talk in terms of deep integration? And then you look at what's happening to the euro. See, once you understand where they want to take us and the methods used to take us there, the world kind of opens up, becomes an open book. People are saying, oh, big problems with the euro. Yes, because they're supposed to be. You see, the euro is not an end. It's a stepping stone to an end, which is this single electronic world currency. Thus, they were faced with a massive currencies in Europe, the Deutschmark, the Guilder, the Lira, the Franc, and they are on their way in their goal to this single electronic currency. And they've got all these currencies that they're faced with. So you introduce the euro and you delete all those currencies from countries that have joined the euro in one fell swoop. And now you are a massive step closer to your single electronic currency. So the euro, at some point, I'm not saying tomorrow, but at some point, the euro is absolutely going to be crashed so it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, what are people going to say? Do something. Well, you know, the only way out of this is an electronic currency, a single electronic currency for the world and all that stuff. And in terms of the World Central Bank that I talked about to dictate all global finance, the Vatican's just come out in the last few weeks calling for a World Central Bank and a global government. George Soros, this billionaire financier, an absolute bagman agent for the cabal, not least the House of Rothschild, he's calling for a World Central Bank. Why? Because of the global economic crash. Who crashed the global economy? The people like Soros and the cabal he represents. So all the time we are being manipulated by creating crises and then offering the solution to the crises. And just very quickly, one other thing, one other technique that is like the stablemate, the bedfellow of problem, reaction, solution is what I call the totalitarian tiptoe. And that's when you know you're going to Z, but if you go from A to Z in too big a leaps, then people are going to look up from the game show and the sport event and say what's going on, because the change is going to be so blatant. So you go as big in a bigger leap as you can towards that goal, but not so fast that you alert too many people, or not so fast that people start to see that actually these steps are not in isolation, they're actually connected. And that brings us back to Europe. The day after I was born, on April the 30th, 1952, 60 years ago nearly, the man who is still today called the father of Europe, the father of what became the European Union, a man called Jean Monnet, another front man for the House of Rothschild. He wrote a letter to a friend 60 years ago. And in summary, this is what he said. We are going to take the people of Europe into a superstate in stages by stealth, and each stage along the road we're going to justify further and further integration by economic means. And he also points out that each stage of centralization would be promoted as unconnected to all the other stages. And so what we've seen, if you look at it through the decades, is the constant centralization of power in Europe, to the point now, thanks to the Lisbon Treaty, it is phenomenal. And they want more, even more, much more. And they have been using economic means to justify these stages. And here we are sitting here today, and they're doing precisely that again. Economic catastrophe in Europe. We need to have a European Union treasury, they're saying now, to dictate the tax and financial policies of every country in Europe, and centralization and deep integration. They're still doing it, and we need to get wise to it, because if we don't, then not even our children and grandchildren are going to live in a fascist nightmare. If we have got much time left in our lives, we're going to experience it, because it will be there within 10 years. And I might even be being optimistic about that unless we intervene. I was in the Wall Street protests not long ago, as we speak, about 2 weeks ago, when I spoke in New York. And I saw a lot of very, very genuine people who had genuinely got to that point, and it's happening all around the world, where people were saying, I realize that I'm a slave and that I've been caught in a system of slavery thinking I was free. And they're beginning to see that the tiny few, in this case, bankers, are dictating to the lives of billions, right? So that's a good thing. But you're right. One of the main reasons that I've been doing what I have for the last 22 years is trying to communicate information so that people get streetwise to how the game's played. Because if we don't get streetwise to that, the game plays us. And we can get in a situation where we think we're challenging the game, but actually we're serving the game. And, you know, when we're talking about people's protests, of course, you can't really talk about Wall Street and Occupy protests without coming into the Middle East and North Africa. Because those protests have been massively and continue to be massively manipulated. Again, we come back to our friend, for want of a word, George Soros. George Soros runs a network of organizations like the Open Society Institute and the International Crisis Group, which are specialists in manipulating people's revolutions, quote, to change regimes, to give the impression that the people have spoken to change the regime, when actually the agents provocateurs and the people that triggered the initial protests, which brought lots of genuine people onto the streets, were trained and funded by his network and by the United States. And at the end of it, Soros's people, the cabal's people, end up in power. And the classic is, well, of course, earlier than that, around Eastern Europe, we saw the Ukraine Orange Revolution, we saw the Rose Revolution in Georgia, what have you, and they were manipulated by this Soros network. I mean, some journalists of the mainstream media in Georgia have said, yeah, it's open knowledge that Karkashvili or Karkrashvili, I should call him, really, because I think he's just a diabolical leader. He was put into place after the Rose Revolution, and he was educated in America and prepared in America. And so Soros was doing it in Eastern Europe, and also in league with a man called Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was at one time Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And together, Brzezinski and Soros are major manipulators, handlers, mentors, and in Soros's case, funder of Barack Obama. So he's their man. And so if we come into to Egypt, during the overthrow of Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia, there were groups created by a couple of Serbians called Marovic and Popovic, I think Popovic. And one was called Canvas and one was called Otpor, which I understand means resistance. And these were organizations to train people in civil disobedience and the kind of thing we saw in Egypt, the kind of thing we're seeing in Wall Street. And they were funded by the United States and the NATO operation. And after the end of that conflict, they continued to be funded. And they have openly admitted that they trained key members of the initial triggering of the Egyptian revolution, the original one, in the art of doing that. It's also now been established that those people that were behind the initial triggering of it had been working with the U.S. Embassy in Cairo for years. They'd been flown to America to meet people and have further training. And one of the key kind of groups involved there was one called the April the 6th Youth Movement. Now, the Serbian guys admit that they trained those people. And, of course, Otpor has this clenched fist logo, and therefore you had the clenched fist logo of the April the 6th Youth Movement. And Marovich turns up in Wall Street making a speech there in the earlier time of the Wall Street occupation. And then you look at a man who, when they started gathering in the square in Cairo, this man got on a plane in Europe and suddenly had this revolutionary fervour and headed for Cairo. And this was Mohammed El-Baradi, who was formerly the head of the UN International Atomic Agency. And he got off the plane in Cairo, and within days, he's one of the leaders of the revolution. And then he said he's going to stand for president when elections come and stuff like that. Well, it just so happens that before he got on the plane, El-Baradi was a board member of the International Crisis Group of George Soros and Zbigniew Brzezinski that specialises in triggering people's revolutions and making sure their guy's in power at the end of it. I'm just hoping that getting this information out, and we're getting it out more and more about Baradi, that it will, throw a spanner in his works in terms of becoming the leader that they want. And then you go to Libya. I mean, the idea that was a genuine revolution in Libya is outrageous when you look at the evidence. They were NATO agents provocateurs that were funded and armed, not least through Qatar, the Emir of Qatar, who does not represent the interests of Arab people. He represents the interests of NATO and that cabal that control NATO. And so you have this situation where one of the military leaders of the rebels in Libya was a man called Khalifa Hifter, who for the previous 20 years had lived in Virginia down the road from CIA headquarters on their payroll. And what they're doing is using individual excuses like, oh, Gaddafi's doing these terrible things to this, oh, Assad, and all this stuff, to pick off country after country in a very systematic way. Because General Wesley Clark, who people in this area of the world will certainly remember, not a man I care for, I have to say, but he said in 2007 in an interview, which you can see on the internet, that a few days after 9/11, he was told by an officer in the Defense Department that in the U.S. military that they were going to invade Iraq. This is not in 2003 when they got round to it. They were going to invade Iraq. They were planning already just after 9/11. So Clark said in this interview that 10 days later, he met this officer again, and he says, what's the latest on invading Iraq? Well, it's worse than that, sir, he said. And he showed him a memo from the Defense Department, which said they were going to take over and invade 7 countries in 5 years. And these countries, they were going to start with Iraq. Then they were going to go Libya, they were going to go Syria, they were going to go Iran, they were going to go Somalia, and on it goes. So what we're seeing now, as with the European Union story, is not something where these people are reacting to events. They're following a script. And the idea of the script in terms of North Africa and the Middle East is to lead us into World War III. You know, I did an interview, a video interview when I came to Croatia. It was the last time or the time before, but maybe 2009, in which I was talking about the plan for the Third World War, because they've always planned 3. Because if you look at a war, especially a world war, whenever there's a war, at the end of it, that society's changed. If it's a world war, the global society's changed. Look at what the world was like after World War II compared with before. Not least, there was far fewer people in control of it. And then you go to the Second World War, exactly the same thing happened, greater centralization of power. The world was redrawn in so many ways. And the idea is to have the Third World War, and that is, as I've been saying for years and years and years, is to bring what we call now NATO countries, Europe and North America, into conflict with Russia and China. And as we sit here now, we're watching these pieces being moved into place so blatantly. There's this constant bloody obsession with invading or bombing Iran, generated by out of Israel overwhelmingly, and with America in its slipstream, and they're picking off these countries one after the other. They're desperate to do the same to Syria that they've done to Libya, and if they do, and also they are drone bombing these unmanned drone aircraft, which are actually flown by joysticks on the other side of the world at the Creech Air Force Base near Las Vegas. And they're killing increasing numbers of civilians in Pakistan. And we've seen, of course, very recently, nearly 30 Pakistan soldiers killed by these drones. And NATO the leader comes along and says, "Oh, sorry, it was an accident." And as the Pakistan authorities have said, you were doing it for 2 hours. That's not an accident. And it wasn't. It's upping the ante. It's pushing the pressure, because we've already got a situation now where China is saying, mess with Pakistan and you mess with us. They've said, in effect, mess with Iran and you mess with us. As we're sitting here talking, Russia has deployed warships to a Syrian port in response to what's going on there. And then just a couple of weeks ago, announced that there were going to be a permanent troop presence in American troops in Australia. And he made the point that the focus of American foreign policy was now going to be Asia and the Pacific. And then you've got Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is such an insider that if you read his books, he's telling you what's going to happen. I mean, you read his books from 30, 40 years ago, and you'll see the world we live in today. But what he talks about in his books is the need to control an area of the world he calls Eurasia. And for people that can come across that term, it's basically Europe across to China and up to Russia and down to the Middle East. This is the very area of the world that all the focus is going on now. Because if Brzezinski says you control Eurasia, you control the world. And what's right in there in the middle of that? Iran. And so we're seeing this script unfold. And unless there is intervention by the people, then it will unfold. And what we are seeing in terms of the occupation protests around the world is the first stirring of people who are now understanding the world's not like they thought it was. They don't understand, most of them anyway, how it really is, but they know that the world's not the place they thought it was in terms of the world they lived in. They're starting to realize that actually a tiny few people, this is where the 99%, 1% comes from, are actually dominating world events and dictating increasingly the fine detail of people's lives. They are deciding if they have a livelihood or not. They're deciding if they have a home or not, and all the rest of it. And so we're getting this stirring of, I've had enough. But what we need to do, which is why I'm working so hard to get this stuff out, is that we need to understand the game we're dealing with, where it wants to take us and the methods it uses to take us there. Because if we don't, then you can get a situation where protest from genuine people is demanding what the cabal wants anyway. Because what we're seeing in Europe with the European Union, ironically, the irony is not lost, is that we have got into this mess by the centralization of power. We got into this mess by having the single currency. We've got into this mess by centralizing power in Brussels, dictating to all these countries. And what are they doing now? They're saying the solution to those problems caused by centralization of power is even more centralization of power. And it's important on the global level to get over this point. I am absolutely vehemently opposed to the abuses and the arrogance of corporations and banks and all the rest of it. But when people talk about we must do this, we must get rid of the banks, we must get rid of the corporations, or we must bring them under control, we got to be very calm and ask, okay, yes, I agree with all that, but how is that done? Because the corporations, mega as they are now in biotech and pharmaceuticals and oil and banking and food production and all the rest of it, and you know, like I say, powerful as the banks are, that is still a stepping stone. This cabal has not brought this situation about of domination by corporations, domination by private banks as an end in itself. It's still a stepping stone. Because what they want is the world government, and then they want world government ministries, just like George Orwell talked about in 1984, because he wasn't coming from his imagination. He got access to the projected agenda through something called the Fabian Society in Britain. And so they want a world ministry of food. That ministry would absorb all the food corporations and would dictate the global food chain in its entirety, no private corporations. Just that would dictate everywhere. You'd have a Ministry of Food department in Croatia, and that would dictate on behalf of the Global Ministry of food policy in Croatia. And you can forget about organic food. You can forget about any food that is nutritious, because they don't want that. This is, you know, you think McDonald's is bad. Well, you let this Ministry of Food get going. And they want genetically modified food because that genetically modifies us for other agendas that they have. They want a world ministry of oil that would take over all the oil corporations, and it would become like a communist situation where the government dictated all the oil infrastructure and everything. They want a world ministry of what they would call health that would absorb all the pharmaceutical corporations, and so it goes on. A ministry of biotech, which would take over Monsanto and all these things. The same people that were running and controlling the corporations would now be running these ministries. And just give them even more power. So where I'm going with this is, if in the Occupy protests people say, yeah, we've got to nationalize and take over all these corporations, yeah, that's what they want. So we have to be streetwise about it. And in terms of how do we respond to this, well, in terms of the way we live our lives and how we structure society, a lot less structure would be great, thank you very much. It's a simple thing. When you're faced with a problem, you can find a solution to it, and we're drowning in them, or you can remove the cause of the problem. And that's always the sensible thing to do. You look at how we've got into this situation of mass human control. And it's through the incessant centralization of decision-making in all areas of our lives. And the answer to that is not more centralization, which is what they're trying to sell us. It's diversity of decision-making. So the people of Croatia decide what happens in Croatia, and then diversify it a bit more and let the regions of Croatia within that structure also have massive devolved powers to decide what happens in their community. We should be having a situation where those making decisions over our lives actually are affected by those decisions, because the decisions tend to be better. We need situations where we can look in the eye the people who are making decisions about our lives. When you have people in dark suits in Brussels, could they care about Croatia? Couldn't care less. They're never going to live here. What happens in Croatia is never going to affect them. So therefore, the decisions they make with regard to Croatia, they have no, there's nothing in it for them. So they make the decisions that suit them, not Croatia. And that's the idea. And we need to be pulling power back from the centre and breaking this incessant, this stampede that it is now, for fewer and fewer people dictating to more and more and more. Well, Iceland is a very interesting story. First of all, when Obama became president, he appointed a man in charge of his entire U.S. budget called Peter Orszag. Peter Orszag, before being given control of the entire budget of the United States, was involved in a company that was advising the Icelandic Central Bank in the run-up to the crash. Oh, my goodness me, what should we do with Peter after all that? Let's give him control over the budget of the United States. I mean, what a joke. The difference in Iceland, and it's a wonderful example, is the Icelandic people, when they were told that they were going to take the consequences for the banking catastrophe caused by the banks, they said, we're not having it. We're not going to take the consequences for that. And Iceland took another direction in which they let the banks fail. And Iceland, therefore, was coming through this with much less trauma than those who have bailed out the banks. Because what we've seen here, and Iceland shows that there is another way. We have seen, since 2008, the biggest transfer of wealth from the population of the world to a tiny elite in known human history. And it's gone like this. First of all, I show in detail in my books how the crash of 2008 was coldly calculated to happen because people like Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the privately owned Central Bank of America, had, through the end of Reagan Bush, through Father Bush, through Clinton and much of Boy Bush, was incessantly deleting checks and balance regulation to put some kind of buffer on unfettered greed. And so by the time he left, I think it was about 2006, because he knew the crash was coming, he wanted out now. And he brings in this guy, Ben Bernanke, who's just his puppet and poodle anyway, from the background. And, of course, the crash happened. And the crash happened because of the banking system. Now we have a banking crisis. But unlike Iceland, all the other countries, because their governments are controlled by the same people that control the banks, they turn the banking crisis into a government debt crisis by bailing out the banks. And then, after that's happened, with them in trouble, the IMF, controlled by the same people that control the governments and control the banking system, and the European Central Bank, controlled by the same people, they come into the countries and say, well, we've got to bail you out now. Oh, and by the way, for us to do that, you've got to sell off your state assets to our corporations, controlled by the same people that control them. And also, you've got to introduce horrific austerity programs hitting the most vulnerable people in society. And in this way, in a few years, 2008 to 2010-11, this banking crisis has been transferred to become a people's crisis. Ireland is a wonderful example. Ireland did not go bankrupt without the bailouts because of the Irish economy. It went bankrupt because the ludicrous Irish government, led by a guy called Brian Cowans, who I wouldn't let loose on a garage sale, bailed out the banks that were failing to such an extent that the government went bankrupt. And this is what has happened. And what we should be doing is letting the banks fall, letting them go. Too big to fail, watch me. Because what's the alternative? That problem is transferred to the people. And what has happened as a result of that, this is really, really, really important if people just deep breath and look at this in a calm way. Zbigniew Brzezinski, in one of his books, talked about the coming technocracy, where technocrats run the world and run countries, not elected, just technocrats, people like bankers and scientists and academics and experts in various fields. He calls it the technotronic era. And here we are now in Europe, and would anyone have believed this just a few months ago? We have a banker as Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Monti, who is the European president of the Trilateral Commission, one of these manipulating groups co-founded by Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he is a banker who's never seen a ballot box in terms of putting him in a position of power. And he's now Prime Minister of Italy, with more than 60 million people and one of the biggest economies in Europe. And he's also in control of their finance. And what is he doing? Now he's agreeing to all these austerity measures being imposed by the banks of the European Union. And then we have Louis Papademos in Greece, another member of the Trilateral Commission, another professional banker who is Prime Minister of Greece, and he's never seen a ballot box either. So the technocrats are moving in. The society that Brzezinski envisaged, he didn't envisage it, he knew it was coming. That's why he wrote about it and was able to be so accurate. And it's coming in. So, I've done quite a lot of research over the years, and a good friend of mine has done even more on this specific organisation. It operates out of Britain, but operates increasingly worldwide. And it's called Common Purpose. And what this organisation is a training organisation to train the leaders, all areas of society, local government, national government, police, all the rest of it. And that organisation in its training programs actually talks about preparing the leaders for the post-industrial, post-democratic society. Because that's what they want, and that's what we're seeing blatantly now in Italy and in Greece. And how has that come about? It's come about because of problem, reaction, solution. And then another key area, of course, in terms of finance and financial control in the European Union is the European Central Bank, which was covertly set up in Frankfurt by the Rothschilds in their historic fiefdom, Frankfurt. And they've just appointed a guy called Mario Draghi as their new head of the European Central Bank. What was he a major executive of? Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs is one of the prime center of everything banking operations that caused the crash of 2008. And we have a situation where after that crash in 2008, the Treasury Secretary of America was a guy called Hank Paulson, Boy Bush's Treasury Secretary in the last couple of years of his second term. And it was Hank Paulson that started this banking bailout, which then Obama picked up and went, crazy with. Hank Paulson joined the Bush administration from his previous job, Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of Goldman Sachs. And what's come out in the last few days is that during the initial aftermath of the initial crash of 2008 in September, he was telling Goldman Sachs and his mates what the policies were going to be. He told them that Lehman Brothers was not going to be saved and was going to go down. And Goldman Sachs was betting like a Las Vegas casino on all these decisions being happening and all these things happening in the financial story of that time. I'm making a fortune out of it. And how could they do that? Because they knew that it was going to happen, because Paulson was telling them. He was the Treasury Secretary. What we're also seeing now, which is another thing to highlight, is that there are 3 credit ratings agencies called Moody, Standard & Poor's and Fitch Ratings that dominate 95% of the credit rating business in the world. These are the same credit ratings agencies that when the banks were building up all these toxic assets through all this criminal activity they were doing, these credit ratings agencies like Moody's were rating this toxic rubbish as AAA, which got people like pension funds to have the confidence to buy it and take it on. And of course, it's worthless, and all these pension people, pensions have been affected as a result. The poor people again, the little people as they call them, and the consequences for the credit ratings agencies of doing that, zilch. Now, who is it that is credit rating countries like Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland, and when they downgrade their credit rating, causes economic catastrophe in those countries? Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch Ratings. So when you control the ratings agencies, as this cabal does, you just get them to downgrade the credit rating of your target country, and the collapse starts. And there was an interesting point, an interesting story in August, when someone was never named. If it wasn't George Soros, then I'd be desperately surprised, or someone connected to him, bet $1 billion that the United States credit rating would be downgraded in a certain period of time. Staggering shock it was. And he won his bet. Why? Because he knew the agencies were going to do it. Mm-hmm. This is how the whole thing's stitched up. And there comes a point where, in the words of the song, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And we'll reach the point now where this system is so stitched up, it's so corrupt, it is so targeting the people of the world in such a abusive way that we really have nothing left to lose. Because if we don't stand up now, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. Well, I can sum up Osama bin Laden's death in Pakistan in one way. And I think they're going to have a movie version of his killing, and they're going to call it You Only Die Twice. Amazing how you can do that. To really understand the bin Laden situation, you have to go back to the man that we talked about in the last program in relation to this global conspiracy and being a mentor of Obama, Zbigniew Brzezinski. When he was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, he ran Carter's foreign policy. It was famous that within the administration, when Carter was ever asked anything about foreign policy, he said, "What does Brzezinski think about it?" And so he instigated what became the Mujahideen and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that's not me saying that, that's him saying that. He did an interview some years ago with a French news magazine in which he said that he had embarked upon a policy to what he called give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. Of course, at that time in the 80s, we still had the Soviet Union. And they had a satellite government in Kabul, probably a good slip of the tongue then, Kabul in Afghanistan. And so what Brzezinski said he wanted to do was to start trouble for that satellite government in Afghanistan by training and arming, see present times in Libya and Syria, by arming these freedom fighters that became known as Mujahideen to make life difficult for the government in Kabul. Because what he wanted to do, he said, was entice the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan to protect their satellite government and thus get embroiled in a long war, which is exactly what happened. And so when the Soviet Union, took the bait and went in, they wanted a figurehead, the Americans, Brzezinski, and what followed him with Reagan Bush. They wanted a figurehead that could be, the name around which the resistance to the occupation of the Soviet Union could be promoted. And so onto the scene comes Osama bin Laden, on the CIA payroll, fronting up the leadership of the Mujahideen, which eventually became the Taliban, or part of it did. And of course, you had the 10-year civil war and occupation in Afghanistan, and eventually the Soviet Union were forced out, and 1 million Afghans died, and never mind the Soviet troops as well. And then you had the Mujahideen, and then becoming the Taliban. You had that now in place. And there was this morphing, eventually, from Osama bin Laden being the pin-up boy of the Americans, leading up the resistance to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, to becoming numero terrorist. And he, of course, was blamed for 9/11, which is a joke, a fantasy beyond fantasies when you actually do a modicum of research into the official story of 9/11. It was obviously an inside job involving American military and intelligence, definitely Mossad, massive involvement, and British intelligence would have been there somewhere, and always is. And so he got the rap, if you like, for being this villain terrorist, just to hide the fact that the real people were behind it. And also, by blaming Osama bin Laden, who was said to be located in Afghanistan, now they've got the excuse, problem, reaction, solution to invade Afghanistan. And so this happened, and we're going to get bin Laden. Remember, we're going to get bin Laden. That was Boy Bush's mantra immediately after 9/11. And then suddenly, he disappears. Every now and again, he will appear on a video. Videos, by the way, these videos of bin Laden that they put out into the media every little while, ever since 9/11. They were put into the media network by a lady called Rita Katz, who is the daughter of a Mossad agent, and she runs an organization called SITE, and there's another Israeli who runs an organization called Intel Center in America, and they're both Mossad fronts, and they're the organizations that have been putting these videos out of Osama bin Laden. And the thing to remember, as I emphasize these days, is computer graphics and voice recognition technology that can make a voice sound like someone else's if you've got the frequency. And of course, you've only got to have a recording of the person, you've got the frequency. Are so sophisticated now that literally you cannot believe your eyes and ears when you're looking at some of this stuff. But putting a bin Laden video together after he's died, making threats to the West, piece of cake. If people go to my website, davidicke.com, they'll find some videos there just showing actors, regular actors in Hollywood, doing their scene next to a blue screen or a green screen behind them, nothing else. And then you'll see the actual film of that dialogue. And they're in a street.
Kada je Osama bin Laden umro onda?
Well, as I was saying, these videos have been put out and they've perpetuated the myth that he was still alive. Now, it's very clear, and indeed this has appeared in the mainstream media, that bin Laden had very, very serious kidney disease, malfunction. And it was reported in the mainstream media in the summer of 2001 that he was having dialysis treatment at the American hospital in Dubai and was visited by the CIA station chief in Dubai. I mean, if he's this villain that they say he is, and this master bloody terrorist, then why don't they just take him out there? Why don't they just pick him up there? And it's very clear that he had very serious problems and needed dialysis treatment. And the former president of Pakistan, Musharraf, he said that bin Laden was dead. Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, said in an interview with a guy called David Frost in England, America, that he was dead. And then when he was supposed to have died for the second time, a man in America called Steve Pieczenik, who has served at a very significant level in a number of American administrations, he went public and said, this is nonsense, what they're saying about the shooting of bin Laden, because he said, we knew that bin Laden died in 2001 from kidney failure. And in fact, not just kidney failure, he was more specific. He said bin Laden died from something called Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome is something that is genetic, inherited, and one of the traits of Marfan syndrome is the long face and the long limbs, which is exactly what bin Laden had. And it attacks the connecting tissue of the body, and it causes something else, severe and potentially fatal kidney malfunction. So we started to see why he had this kidney situation going. And there was a report in an Egyptian newspaper of his funeral in 2001. Then if you fast forward to when he's supposed to have been shot in the compound, actually it was a house, but compound sounds scary, so we'll call it a compound. When they announced this, and I'd stopped laughing, which took some time, I'm waiting for a mention in the compound of dialysis equipment, dialysis machines, not to mention, until eventually there was one, in the context of they didn't find any. So here's a man who needed he had an extreme kidney problem which needed dialysis treatment regularly. And somehow he's been in this compound for 5 years without any dialysis equipment, because they're saying he never left. And then they're saying that the CIA were kind of keeping surveillance on this compound, and they kept seeing this man who they called the pacer in this ridiculous story, walking around the garden with a walking stick and stuff like that. And they thought, ooh, we thought it was bin Laden, but we weren't. You weren't sure. With the technology of surveillance you have in the sky that can take a number plate from space and you don't know it's bin Laden, it's a fantasy. And then, of course, when they said they killed him with these Navy SEALs, okay, show us the body. Show us. Oh, no, we can't show you the body because he was buried at sea according to Muslim custom. Muslim custom, buried at sea. Yeah, it's great if you live in the middle of Saudi Arabia, isn't it? Bit of a problem. But anyway, so we've not got any body. Okay, what a surprise. Okay, show us the pictures. Oh, no, we're not showing the pictures because they're not very nice and we don't do things like that. Well, you did with Saddam Hussein's sons, blood and gore, when they were dead and all that stuff. Because the reason they're not showing us the pictures is because there aren't any. Because he died in 2001. And it's no coincidence that a few weeks, maybe a bit more than that, but not long, after bin Laden was killed by these Navy SEALs, according to the official story, that a number of Navy SEALs from the same group that's supposed to have killed bin Laden died in a helicopter crash. Now, if you, in Afghanistan now, if you look at the way the American military manipulates information in times of conflict and war and stuff, you will very, very rarely, if ever, see them, unless they can't hide it, admit that the enemy has had a victory against them, like shooting one of the helicopters down. They'll say it was friendly fire, or they'll say it was a mechanical failure. They won't admit that the enemy's, had a victory. What they did when those Navy SEALs died in the helicopter crash is they immediately came out and said it was shot down by the Taliban. Why? They never killed bin Laden, those Navy SEALs, but they also knew that bin Laden wasn't killed because they weren't involved in it. And so you want to remove any danger that someone on the inside who knows is actually going to, at some point, talk about it. And then you had the famous picture of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and all those people sitting around the table with the switched-off laptops, looking in that direction, you know. And it went around the world immediately because, you know, as I've said so many times, the idea is not to inform people, it's to sell them an image. So immediately you say that something has happened, you then keep banging out things that support that story. So you say that Obama and Hillary Clinton and all these people in the administration were there watching live footage of bin Laden being shot. Well, and there's Hillary Clinton like that. Oh. And then you find out, they had to admit it a few days later, there was no live footage of bin Laden being shot. Not least because he wasn't shot. But the question is, so what were they looking at? I mean, was Hillary Clinton kind of anxious about a crack in the wall? I mean, what's going on? What were they looking at? And now we see from this situation that they set them up in the room, told them where to look and how to look, and then took this fake picture and put it out as if they're watching live footage that they had to admit later didn't exist. This is the scale of manipulation of world events that we're dealing with. These people have no shame. Then we had this footage released of this of Osama bin Laden changing the television channel. No. We didn't see Osama bin Laden. We saw a guy with a beard and a hat. And bin Laden was seriously left-handed, and this guy's changing the channels with his right hand. And if you remember, as he's changing the channels, he's on every one. Now, somebody just work out the statistical chances that bin Laden would be flicking through television channels and everyone would be him. Have you ever flicked through television channels in any country in the world that many times and not hit the adverts? or another program? I mean, it's oh my goodness me! They must think we're totally stupid. And then they say they found this new footage, and then you look at it and you find it's old footage that they're calling new footage. And the whole story was just an absolute tissue of ludicrous lies. But here's the real kind of punchline. You look at any news organisation anywhere in the world, mainstream, newspaper, radio, television, or for virtually any of them anywhere in the world, and if they are doing anything on bin Laden, they'll say that he was shot by Navy SEALs in a compound in Pakistan. I mean, and when the whole idea is absolutely ludicrous, just as they'll give you the official story of 9/11 when you know, a 14-year-old could take it apart. Mm-hmm. And some of them have, because it's so blatantly a tissue of lies. This is what we're dealing with, and I don't know whether they are getting more and more overconfident or whether they're just getting more lax, or whether it's because I'm understanding more about how they work all the time. But it's just so blatantly obvious the way they're lying to us. But the mainstream media, who should be in there straight away, hold on a second, what do you mean you're not giving us the pictures? What do you mean Muslim custom? None of it. Repeaters, that's what they are, repeaters, repeating the official story for the public. Well, there would have been a number of reasons, but I mean, I'll tell you one reason, which has become blatantly obvious. I said it at the time, and it's becoming more obvious now. It was the real start of the process of demonizing Pakistan, because they were saying that Pakistan cannot be trusted as an ally in the war against terror, as they call it, when they must have known that bin Laden was in the compound, because it just happened to be near a military base, just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. And thus, we must treat them in a different way. And all these neocons in America, like David Frum, who was the Bush speechwriter who came up with the phrase, the axis of evil, Iran, Iraq and North Korea, he came out immediately after the bin Laden non-killing, saying, hey, we must completely change our policy towards Pakistan now. And since that, since that non-death of bin Laden in Pakistan, they have upped the ante in terms of the drone attacks on Pakistan. They've killed thousands of civilians in Pakistan. And what does Pakistan have a border with? China, which is where, as we talked last time, which is where, in line with Russia, they want to bring those two countries into a third world war with the NATO countries. And of course, that area there, Pakistan and Afghanistan, all around there, is absolutely in that central area where this conflict is designed to take place, or not to be triggered out of. Well, for many, many years now, I've been ticking off the ever-increasing sources of radiation to which humans are subjected. And they are so numerous and being added to all the time. It was very clear to me that there is an agenda here of subjecting humanity to more and more radiation. It's a long story and there's many, many elements to why, but the fact that they're doing it is becoming obvious. And so when the explosions at Fukushima happened in Japan, from my perspective, having looked at this over a number of years, it was just too much of a gift to this cabal, given the scale, the stunning scale of radiation that not only was released immediately, but has gone on being released ever since. And, you know, there's reports recently out of Europe of finding these high levels of radiation. And it's like, where's it coming from? Well, there's a very good chance of where it's coming from, because Fukushima has been pouring this stuff out incessantly, day after day after day. So I started looking into it, and one of the first things I noticed, and other people started looking at this as well, was that the explosion that was captured on video of one of the reactors exploding in Fukushima, and the explosion, the smoke stack of a small nuclear device were extraordinarily similar. So I then started looking at anything that could have explained this. And I came across the fact that in the years leading up to Fukushima, those reactors and that site in general had installed a new surveillance camera and sensor system with these this technology put into the reactors and other parts of the site. And when you look at it, you know today that technology is getting ever lighter, it's getting ever smaller. And yet, when you looked at these cameras and sensors that were installed into Fukushima in the months before this happened, they were like ludicrous. You remember, you get these little tiny kind of mobile phones now. And yet, when mobile phones started, they were about that big, and you're as old as you here with two hands, you know. Well, that was the kind of difference between the kind of surveillance technology you see normally now and these things. They weighed 1,000 pounds. And then, when you put one of those next to what they call a gun-type nuclear weapon, which is a small nuclear device, if you take the casing off the gun-type nuclear weapon, what is inside is, shall we say, not a million miles from what these cameras and sensors look like. And it was, with other information, it was my view, I concluded, that these were small nuclear devices and that Fukushima was blown up on purpose to release that radiation as part of this much wider radiation agenda to irradiate the atmosphere of the planet much more than it has been up to this point. And then I asked, of course, asked the question, who put these devices in, these sensors in? And it turns out to be an Israeli company located at Dimona in Israel. And Dimona is the location of the massive Israeli nuclear weapons program. And I can tell you from 22 years of research, there is no such thing as an Israeli security company that is not a front for Mossad. It's not allowed. And then there was a man called Arnie Gunderson, who's a nuclear engineer. And he made a speech in Boston. And it was almost like an alert. It was like, hey, we found something about Fukushima which should not have happened, and this has great implications for, containment design and nuclear design. And what he'd found from the footage is that the explosions at Fukushima moved so fast that they passed the speed of sound and entered the realm of what is known as a detonation wave. And as he pointed out, a nuclear explosion at a nuclear plant like that should never, ever become a detonation wave. It produces what they call a deflagration wave, which is below the speed of sound. And his alert was, hey, we had no idea this was possible. He says, I've talked to a bunch of chemists and we can't work out how it is possible for a nuclear explosion at a plant like that to cause a detonation wave. Well, maybe it wasn't a nuclear explosion of that kind that caused the detonation wave, but a device designed to detonate. And it is my strong view that Fukushima was blown up on purpose to release this stunning level of radiation. And then, of course, the question comes, okay, so you're saying they put these things in and blew it up, and then they just sit around strumming their fingers, hoping that some kind of earthquake and tsunami comes along as cover for it. Well, no, which is when we come to what you've just mentioned, HAARP. And HAARP relates to a man very well known in this area of the world, Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was the scientific genius of the 20th century, and if he was alive today, he'd be the scientific genius probably of the first part of the 21st century. He had understood many things about the nature of our reality. He'd understood about the electromagnetic fields that you can access and turn into usable warmth and power, which the cabal that owns the energy industry of the world has been suppressing because it doesn't want people to have access to this free energy, which we could have. And by the way, the same people who are saying we must lower carbon emissions because of global warming, which is another nonsense, this human-caused global warming lie, they're the same people that are suppressing the development of use of free energy technology, which Tesla developed and understood, which could eliminate the carbon power systems, immediately. So it's all a lie. But what HAARP does is it fires radio waves, very, very focused and very powerful, into the upper atmosphere known as the ionosphere, and it entrains, as they say. It gets the ionosphere to vibrate in sympathy with the radio wave. And this creates a situation where this entrainment adds massive, massive, massive power to the original radio wave, and then it's bounced back to Earth, massively greater power, and they can hit a specific spot on the Earth. And if they can hit somewhere which is vulnerable in terms of earthquakes anyway, and they can do it at a specific frequency, because the earthquakes have a frequency like everything does, then they can cause an earthquake and they can cause a tsunami. And they can cause, with the same principle, they can cause very great extremes of weather, like hundreds of unprecedented tornadoes that appeared in 2007 and killed hundreds of people in America. And, you know, people say, oh, no, you can't mess with the weather, it's ridiculous. Well, hold on a second. There are international treaties which countries have signed saying that it's illegal to manipulate the weather and to use it as a weapon of war. Well, they're not going to have those treaties unless they know it's possible. It's ridiculous. And so we have a situation where, yes, of course there are natural earthquakes, but they don't all have to be. And you can bomb somewhere from an aircraft, or you can cause devastating earthquakes and devastating weather events, and you can bring the countries to their knees that way. And in many ways, you know, people within countries, many of them anyway, within the establishment, you know, they know that Fukushima and that earthquake and tsunami and everything, they know it was created. It wasn't a natural event. And what that says to them, and what they're saying to them with that event is, if you say no to us, look what we can do. If they want to bring Japan to its knees, they've got to find a way, like they did in with the two, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. But today they would have to find an excuse to send the boys in. Well, they can't find an excuse. So instead of that, we'll go the way that they have, because Japan is over. It's over. The amount of radiation that has been released into the Earth's atmosphere is potentially catastrophic. The amount that's been released in the immediate area around Japan and the wider Japan is unthinkably catastrophic. And we you know, I mean, people are already starting to go down with the effects of it, and we've seen nothing yet. This was you know, you have these James Bond movies, written by a British intelligence agent, by the way, where you have the guy on the island with the fantastic technology, or the guy with the satellite in the sky that can, you know, cause devastation on Earth. And he holds the world to ransom on the basis of I won't use it only if you do this. Blackmail. Well, this is what's happening in the real world because of this technology that they have. And, you know, Tesla, in an interview with the New York Times in the 1940s, I think it was, maybe a bit earlier, he said that he had the technology to split the Earth in half then. He was producing lightning around his home in New York. The neighbors were calling the police. He was causing kind of mini earthquakes, getting the Earth to shake because of the technology he had, and thousands of windows were breaking before he could switch it off. And Bernard Eastland, the man who applied, first of all, for the patent for the technology that is used in HAARP, based in Alaska, but there's connecting technology all around the world. That's just the main focal point. He mentions Tesla when he's applying for the patent. It's Tesla technology. And if Tesla could, you know, do that devastation he said he could do back in the 1930s and 40s, what the heck can they do now? So instead of, you know, it's not really a case of, what do you mean they can cause earthquakes? That's crazy. No. Causing earthquakes is a piece of cake for this technology. And thus, you know, you have a situation in 2010 when in the run-up to it, in the years running up to 2010 around Haiti, it was established that there were major resources under the sea in Haiti waters. In 2010, there's a devastating earthquake brings the end to Haiti. It just so happened, that the American military were having an exercise at exactly the same time that was based on a scenario of reacting to, I think it was a hurricane or something like that, hitting Haiti. And they were down in Florida doing their exercise. And then the earthquake happened and they said, we just switched from exercise to real thing. And they were in there in no time. And if you remember, the aid agencies that were trying to land in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, they were saying in the immediate days after the earthquake, the American military have taken over the airport, so they're not letting us in. They took the place over. And then along came Clinton and Boy Bush as the people that were going to front up the Haiti Reconstruction Fund, and then they disappeared, and Haiti, virtually nothing's been done, because the idea was to destroy Haiti, take it over, because then you've got the resources. And you can do that with an earthquake. How are they going to justify destroying Haiti by dropping bombs on it? I mean, they're not going to do it. But you can do it through HAARP and earthquakes. And the weather wars and the geological wars are not some science fiction fantasy. They're happening now. Well, people dismiss things by reflex action. And if they only took a deep breath and looked at it again, they'd see the validity of it and the stupidity of their dismissal. For instance, I hear people say, whoa, organic food, what do you mean, it's fine, it's fine. So, you're saying that organically grown food that does not have poisons sprayed on it incessantly is no better and no different from this food that does have poisons sprayed on it incessantly. They must tell earthling jokes on other planets. They must really. It's like, let's just think about this. You grow food, you spray lethal poisons on it. You then sell it in the shops, and people eat it. I mean, what? And thus, when they're putting poisons and chemicals and additives in food, they're putting fluoride in water. They want to put lithium in water now. The happy drug, basically. So we'll love our servitude, as the old saying goes. And we are being hit by these things all the time. And the question, and genetically modified food, which is designed to genetically modify us. And so the question is, why are they doing it? Why are they putting these poisons in food? When I grew up as a kid in England in the 1950s, they didn't do it then. Why are they doing it now? Why do they put growth hormones they inject them into cattle and animals? To make them fatter quicker. And people say, that's to make them fatter quicker so that they'll make more money. Yes, but when you eat the meat, it's still got the growth hormone in it. No wonder people are getting obese. And this is happening. And we need really, if we're going to understand our situation, to realize that there is an agenda here for a massive attack on humans mentally, emotionally, and physically. And a lot of it's done through these poisons in the food and drink. But you raise another aspect, which is so important, which is these light bulbs. I have written extensively about these in a book called Remember Who You Are. This is out in early 2012. And I talk about them, in my events, because whenever you have a situation where something is patently ludicrous to pursue, but they still pursue it, despite how ridiculous it is, then it's time to look, because it's the agenda at work. For instance, the idea about human-caused climate change is a scientific, it's scientific imbecility. And yet, even though it's been demolished, and more scientists that at one time were in favor of it are coming out and saying, actually, it's a nonsense, the political policy is still pushing on as if it's real. Why? Because it's just an excuse. And one of the things that they have use this excuse to impose upon people increasingly are these twiddly so-called green light bulbs. Now let's look at this from a it's ludicrous but they still push it on perspective. These light bulbs, first of all, the light they give off is absolutely rubbish. They don't give off a light anything like those of the incandescent light bulbs that we've had up to this point. And it was just great to come to my hotel in Zagreb and I look in the light bulbs in the room, as I always do, to see what they are. And they were incandescent, yes. Because I've been on a tour through Australia and New Zealand and America. These bloody twiddly things are everywhere, right? And they say they save energy. They don't if you switch them on and off. And have you noticed that's what you tend to do with light bulbs? You switch them on and off. Well, when you do often, they're not even more energetically efficient. Then you look, and this has been scientifically shown to be in experiments, they give off radiation, here we go again, and lethal chemicals cumulatively. There are people who have got as close to them as they would to a normal light with no problem, and suddenly they've got massive rashes on their face that are there for permanently. They will not go away. And then there's just the little matter that these light bulbs contain mercury. And mercury is absolutely lethal. In Remember Who You Are, when I'm talking about these light bulbs, I print in full the British kind of safety manual for what you do if one of these things breaks. And it's everything virtually short of evacuate the building. It's extraordinary what they say you have to do if one of these things breaks, which light bulbs tend to do. And there was a woman in America, they want to make them compulsory there, starting through beyond 2012. But of course, they've got lots of people now think, well, I'll be green and I'll put these light bulbs in. Well, she bought some, and one of them broke in her daughter's bedroom. So she then called Home Depot, where she bought them from, and asked what she did. And they said, well, you better call the state government, which she did. And they said, well, you're going to have to call this company in to basically clean up the poison, the toxic mess. $2,000 she was charged to clean up the effects of one of these light bulbs in one room in her house. And if you go on the internet and you put in words to the effect of, green light bulbs, consequences, dangers, anything like the words like that, you'll see story after story of the health effects in many, many different ways of these bulbs. So you put all that together and you think the idea of using these bulbs is crazy. Okay. But they've gone on beyond that in the European Union, and they're doing this in other parts of the world. They're not encouraging you only to use these bulbs. They're telling you you must, and they're banning, they have banned in European Union, the alternatives. You're not allowed to produce them, import them, etc. any longer. So it's like fluoride in the water. Mm-hmm. This substance they use in rat poison and mind-changing drugs. If you say, OK, we encourage you to use it, fluoride, because it's good for your teeth. It absolutely isn't. It's terrible for your teeth, not least through fluorosis. But they don't do that. They put it in your drinking water. So you haven't got a choice unless you use bottled water. And thus, why are they forcing it upon people instead of just encouraging them? Because it's the agenda to poison us and in terms of the light bulbs, there's another agenda too. But so you've got the situation where the light bulbs give off rubbish light, and when they break, they're lethal and all the rest of it. And when you think, just take the American example. At any point in America, there are billions and billions of light bulbs. When they come to the end of their life, in terms of the incandescent ones, well, you put them on a tip or wherever they go. Or if they break, you get a brush and dustpan and you just sweep them up. End of story, gone, fine. What about when, and we're doing it in Europe already, you have billions and billions of these light bulbs containing mercury? What they're saying in these must-do blooming safety things, manuals, is when these bulbs come to the end of their life, they have to be disposed of as toxic waste. Well, of course, most people aren't going to do that and go through all the toxic waste procedure of getting rid of a light bulb. They're going to go in the tips, in the landfill tips, and they're going to break, and the mercury is going to go into the water supply and the groundwater supply. So all this is absolutely ludicrous. So why are they pushing on with it and enforcing it upon people? Well, this is why. And some people might find this strange, but hear me out. What they are is transmitters of information. And they connect into something that I'm seeing increasingly all over the world, and wherever it's introduced, the people are saying, this is terrible, we don't want this, you've got to have this. And that is smart meters, electricity meters, which is part of what they want to be a global grid of electricity supply, which they're calling the smart grid. They want the smart grids in every country and the country smart grids connecting to all the other smart grids to have a global grid. And how it works, for people who haven't come across it, and it's being enforced all over the world, not least in the European Union. They want 80% of the European Union, I think it's by 2020, with these smart meters, for reasons I'm going to come to. They create these smart meters. They generate the equivalent in your home of the wireless internet. So what is that? That's yet another field of radiation in your home and your business, which you're subjected to 24/7 once these things happen and are introduced. And this smart grid wireless internet is designed to interact with what they want to bring in, which is microchip domestic appliances like fridges and heaters and stuff like that. And this is not me, I think this is happening. I am quoting their own documents, their own public documents here. They will have a situation where they can turn your heating down from a central point. You won't have any choice in that. They turn it down whenever they want. They can turn your electricity off from a distance. They can turn your fridge off. They can know when your fridge door's open. Because of the way the information field, because that's what it is, picks up things, they'll know how many people are in your house and even what rooms they're in. It's a surveillance operation, massive surveillance operation, which will feed all this information to a central point. Now, it's not just a surveillance operation, but it's most certainly that. It's also about feeding you in your home and business subliminal information within the frequency range of human brain activity, so that you take this stuff and you decode it through the electrical system of the brain, if you like, and you think you're having your own thoughts, your own perceptions, when what you're doing is reading and becoming influenced by this subliminal information. And this is where these light bulbs come in. I quote in Remember Who You Are and in my events, scientists who've done research into the effect of what they call ELF waves, extremely low frequency waves, and how they can manipulate us mentally, emotionally, and physically. There was one particular area of research into something called the woodpecker signal. People might remember this, when the Soviet Union was found to be broadcasting a signal into the United States, and it was called the woodpecker signal because it went like a woodpecker, like that. And what it was doing was broadcasting information in this signal into the United States in an attempt to influence the perceptions and views and thoughts of the population. And what these scientists found is what this woodpecker signal was doing was connecting into the power grid, as they put it, being radiated by the power grid, given greater power. And it was going into the homes and being broadcast into the homes through the light fittings. Now, that was a case of hacking in to an electricity grid and light fittings that were not purpose-built to do that. They just hacked into the electricity grid as it has been up to this point. What the smart grids are, and these ludicrous light bulbs, they are a purpose-built delivery system of subliminal information into every home and every business within the frequency range of human brain activity. Thus, they are not only a constant surveillance on everything that's happening in your house, they are also feeding you subliminal thoughts and impacting upon your opinions and your perception of self and the world. This is what's happening. And people may laugh, and I really don't care. People laughed at a lot of things I said a long time ago, and they're not laughing now because they're happening. This is what we're faced with. And this is the reason why these light bulbs are so ludicrous in terms of being used in homes and businesses, both in terms of or in terms of the light they give off, rubbish, in terms of the chemicals and radiation they give off, and in terms of the mercury inside them, which has to be disposed of. The reason they're pushing these, despite all of that, is because the real reason for them is not light. Mm-hmm. It's delivering subliminal information into your home and business 24/7.